At 28, Noah Lyles, finally named the 5 runners. He hated the most. There is a version of Noah Lyles the world never fully saw. Not the arm sleeves, not the superhero poses, not the smile that made sprinting look like a performance designed specifically for the people watching it. There is a version that existed in the silence before races, in the training sessions where the body was pushed past the point where confidence alone could carry it, in the moments when the name on the start list beside his own produced something that the celebrations were specifically designed to conceal. At 28, far enough from nothing and close enough to everything, Lyles named 5 runners who made that version of him necessary. Every world title he collected, every Diamond League final he controlled, every finish line he crossed with a margin that made the result look inevitable. All of it was shaped by the men who forced him to become more than he would have been without them. At 28, he finally said their names. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred, 5 men he genuinely could not stand to race. Number 5, Fred Kerley. The American who made hatred feel like a domestic dispute. Fred Kerley did not arrive from another country with a different flag and a different system and a different set of expectations that made rivalry feel clean and simple. He arrived from the same federation, the same national championship circuit, the same selection process that forced them onto the same start line before the world was watching. In the moments when the result carried consequences that no global final could replicate, Kerley was not smooth in the way that distance creates comfort. He was present in the way that proximity makes everything more complicated. Physically imposing, technically sound in a manner that communicated he had not arrived at the front of American sprinting by accident or by inheritance. He had built himself into the standard, and the standard, in Kerley's understanding of it, did not have Noah Lyles' name permanently attached to it. The 2023 World Championships in Budapest produced the moment that defined what existed between them most clearly. Lyles had arrived as the defending champion. Kerley had arrived as the man who had decided defending champions are simply men who won the last time. The 100-metre final placed them beside each other in a way the sport had been anticipating for 2 years. Lyles won the 200, Kerley won the 100. The split result communicated something that a single decisive outcome would have resolved more cleanly. Neither of them owned the conversation entirely. Neither of them could point to a result that settled the argument the American sprint community had been having about which of them was its genuine standard. Lyles said what Kerley gave him was not the hatred of a rival who came from somewhere else and could be managed through distance. It was the hatred of someone who existed inside the same world and refused to accept the hierarchy that Lyles' results had established. The specific discomfort of a man who disputes not just the finishing order, but the premise that the finishing order was ever settled to begin with. That is a different category of hatred from hating someone who beats you. It is hating someone who makes you feel that everything you have built is still an open argument. Number 4. Marcel Jacobs. The Italian who took the gold nobody saw coming and never fully gave it back. Marcel Jacobs of Italy won the Olympic 100-metre gold at the Tokyo Games in 2021. He was not the name the narrative had been building toward. He was not the man the sport had spent the previous 4 years identifying as the heir to the era Bolt had vacated. He was, by the conventional reading of the start list, a sprinter whose ceiling had not been established clearly enough to justify the result he produced. And then he produced it. Lyles was not in the 100-metre final in Tokyo. He was a 200-metre specialist at that point in his career, still constructing the argument that he was something larger than a single event competitor. But Jacobs winning the gold that the sport had left open, the gold that existed in the vacuum Bolt's retirement had created, in a time and with a margin that produced genuine shock across the entire sprinting world, landed differently than a result in a race Lyles had not entered should have landed. because it established a hierarchy. It put a name on the title, and the name was not his. Jacobs successfully defended the European standard he had established in Tokyo. Every time his name appeared on a start list beside Lyles in the events that followed, the gold medal Tokyo had produced sat between them in a way that the results of individual Diamond League meetings could not fully resolve. Jacobs had something Lyles had not been present to contest. And the specific hatred of a result you cannot retroactively enter is a hatred with no clean resolution. Lyles said what Jacobs gave him was the hatred of an outcome that existed before the argument had properly begun, of a title that was handed to someone else in a room you were not invited into, and the knowledge that the record books would carry that result exactly as it happened, unchanged, regardless of everything that came after. Number 3. Kenny Bednarek. The training partner who made hatred feel like betrayal. Kenny Bednarek arrived in the same professional environment Lyles occupied and did something that external rivals are never positioned to do. He made the internal competition personal in a way that no championship final could replicate. He was not someone Lyles could study from a distance and prepare for, with the clinical detachment that genuine rivalry between athletes from different systems produces. He was present, continuously, in the sessions where the preparation happened rather than the stages where the results were confirmed. Bednarek's 200-metre ability was not a surprise to anyone inside their shared training world. It was a fact the outside world was still catching up to, while Lyles was already carrying it through every session. The speed was genuine. The competitiveness was genuine, and the specific discomfort of knowing that the person closest to your preparation is also the person most capable of undoing your results on the biggest stages is a discomfort that no external rival can produce. The 2022 World Championships 200-metre final. Lyles won. Bednarek finished second. The result confirmed the order that their shared environment had suggested. But the margin, and the manner in which Bednarek had moved through the race, with the specific confidence of someone who had already decided that second place was simply where he had finished this time rather than where he belonged, communicated something the podium photograph did not capture. Lyles said what Bednarek gave him was the hatred that only proximity produces. The hatred of someone who knows everything about your preparation because they have been present for it, who cannot be surprised by what you are capable of because they have already seen it, and who, despite knowing everything, continues to show up in the next lane at every major final with the specific confidence of a man who has simply decided the result can go differently. That is what a dangerous training partner gives you, not defeat in public, the permanent knowledge that someone who knows everything about you has decided it is not enough to stop him. Number 2. Coleman. The man who owned the 100 metres when Lyles was supposed to be arriving. Coleman won the 2019 World Championship 100-metre gold in Doha. He ran 9.76 seconds in a final that communicated, with the specific clarity that World Championship results communicate, that the conversation about who owned the short sprint at the highest level of the sport had a name attached to it, and the name was not Lyles. Lyles was building his 200-metre dominance at exactly the moment Coleman was establishing himself as the most complete 100-metre sprinter in the world. The trajectories ran parallel rather than intersecting cleanly. But parallel trajectories in the same sport on the same global stages, with the same cameras and the same audiences, and the same historical record-keeping score of both, do not feel parallel from the inside. They feel competitive in the way that all proximity to greatness feels competitive when you have already decided that greatness is the only acceptable destination. Coleman's legal troubles disrupted the arc his 2019 performance had established. But when he returned with the specific confidence of a man who had not revised his understanding of where he stood in the event's hierarchy, simply because circumstances had forced an interruption. He came back believing what he had believed before he left, that the 100 metres on its best days had his name on it. Lyles said what Coleman gave him was the hatred of a standard established in his presence that he had not been positioned to contest when it was being set, of watching someone else define the era's ceiling in the event Lyles had identified as the ultimate measure of a sprinter's legitimacy. The 100 metres, the one race the sport uses to name its fastest human, while he was still building the argument that he deserved to be part of that conversation. The hatred was never about Coleman personally. It was about what Coleman's results represented. A timeline that had not waited for Lyles to be ready before distributing its most significant honours. Number 1. Ferdinand Omanyala. The man who made the hatred feel like something the sport was not prepared to discuss. Ferdinand Omanyala of Kenya arrived without the infrastructure that the sport's traditional sprint powers had built across decades, without the established national system, without the historical pipeline of champions that Jamaica and the United States had used to frame their dominance as something close to inevitable. He arrived with raw speed and the specific competitive confidence of someone who had decided that the absence of historical precedent was not a reason to limit what he believed was possible. And he was fast, genuinely uncomfortably fast in a way that the conventional narrative about where sprint talent originates had not prepared the sport to accommodate without friction. Lyles and Omanyala shared start lines at major meetings with the specific energy that exists between two athletes who have both decided the result matters more than the occasion framing it. Omanyala did not treat the presence of the world champion as a reason to adjust his expectations downward. He treated it as the specific condition that made the result worth producing. Lyles said what Omanyala gave him was the most complicated hatred of the five. Not because Omanyala had beaten him in the results that mattered most, but because of what he represented. A version of sprint dominance arriving from a place the sport had not built its power structures to accommodate. A talent that existed outside the narratives Lyles had grown up inside and had spent his career learning to navigate. Racing someone who does not accept the framework you have been operating within is a specific category of discomfort. Not the discomfort of a faster rival. The discomfort of a rival whose presence forces you to acknowledge that the framework itself was never as settled as the people inside it preferred to believe. Omanyala gave him that discomfort at every shared start line, and the hatred it produced was the kind that sits closest to respect, which made it, in the end, the hardest one to carry cleanly. At 28, Noah Lyles had not finished. The titles were accumulating. The records were being approached. The career that had announced itself with the specific confidence of someone who had decided greatness was not a destination, but an expectation, was still in the process of producing everything it had promised. What he had, at 28, was honesty. 5 runners, 5 different versions of the same hatred. Fred Kerley gave him the hatred of someone who disputed the premise of his dominance. Marcel Jacobs gave him the hatred of a result he could not retroactively contest. Kenny Bednarek gave him the hatred that only proximity produces. Coleman gave him the hatred of a standard set before he was ready to challenge it. And Ferdinand Omanyala gave him the hatred that sits closest to respect, which made it the hardest one to name out loud. The world saw the arm sleeves, the poses, the celebrations that made sprinting look like a show designed specifically for the people watching it. What the world did not always see was the 5 names that made the show necessary. At 28, he finally said them out loud.